Right. So, like Christian, I've thought in addition to Ed's throwing ability, I'll also start a stopwatch because I too have a tendency to go on. It's phenomenal to have the speakers that spoke beforehand as well, and not least of all because Mr. France is very famous for his books about the smuggling of nuclear terrorism technology, which I think is incredibly important with regards to some of the threats that we're looking at here. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the emerging threats, but I'm going to put brackets after that and say, are they really emerging, or are they threats that we've seen before, but we just keep forgetting about them and then looking back at them again? Yep, big enough to see. I'm not going to go through all of the different points on this slide, but one of the most often asked questions I have is, well, how likely is each of these attacks, and why hasn't this particular questionable attack occurred to us so far? So I thought it might be useful to put up for reference, and certainly amongst the group here, I believe the slides will be distributed, a sort of a broad relative likelihood of certain different types of attack. And that's drawn off of what we're seeing at the moment as well. We heard from the previous speakers about verification of the use of sarin, chlorine and mustard gases in conflicts really rather than terrorism situations at the moment. But we also forget some of the incidents that have occurred as well. So again, I never end in my sort of amazement that people can remember the anthrax letters in America in 9/11. They forget Pakistan was attacked with anthrax that same year, and then subsequently back in 2012, Pakistan got attacked again with anthrax. The unfortunate connecting theme amongst all of these attacks was that anthrax scientist researchers from government labs tended to be the people carrying out the attacks. So it feels like there's something we probably can do about that. Looking at the emerging threats, though, I promise this will be one of the few asides. As an interesting aside to the US example, the person who was never fully prosecuted, because unfortunately they died before the case could come to full fruition, but who was strongly suspected to have been responsible for the anthrax letters, was actually the person the FBI went to for advice on anthrax letters. So I feel a little bit worried that both myself and Christian may well be on one of the watch lists. It would probably be sensible. Emerging threats, though. You've heard about drones from some of the speakers previously, and they are of issue. They're not a new issue. Drones have been around since about 1985. The Japanese invented them first of all, flying motorbike engines pretty much, which could disperse 20 litres of agent at a time for crop spraying. One of the problems is, and I think this is again reflected in some of my previous sort of panel members' comments, is that the more and more you talk about it, sometimes there is a danger that the terrorist goes, God, they seem very interested about that. Maybe we should start doing that. And certainly when I was investigating the chlorine attacks in Iraq back in 2006 and 2007, it was pretty clear the insurgents had no idea what they were using, but they did see that we kept putting on our respirators and panicking every time a yellow cylinder was put on a bomb. And so we saw more yellow cylinders on bombs, but we didn't really see much improvement in the ability to disperse it. So we always have to be a bit cautious. And I think as the insurance industry looks to discuss these threats, it is also beholden on it to be responsible in identifying those threats. And I think largely it is to now. We also forget some of the complexity of these attacks, and that although some of the CBRN attacks are not perhaps something that we're seeing as the first choice, they are things that people still want to do. And in the Brussels attacks, the discovery of I'd say a very rudimentary attempt at a biological weapon was attempted in sort of a mixture of, apologies for this time in the morning talking about things like this, human feces and rotten meat to try and create some sort of biological weapon. And these things are sort of fairly basic and rudimentary. But again, that's another metric we have to be careful of. We often think about what would be a successful attack or a good weapon using our own metrics of what would be good and what our defense scientists say would be good. It's a problem that UNSCOM and UNMOVIC had in the initial investigations into Iraq when they did have the weapons that we were looking for, in that we kept looking at it from a Western viewpoint and not what would someone do if actually they didn't mind whether they died or not, and they just wanted to create some sort of impact. We've obviously also seen, particularly concerning because of its presence at an international airport, and it's the sort of one of the pictures there on the right with the chaps and the protective equipment, the Malaysia potential use of VX as an assassination. And that's worrying because it's the movement of a very dangerous nerve agent across international boundaries. I won't go over Iraq and Syria. It's been mentioned by previous speakers, but there is a worry about things like that coming over to the UK. And I'd say as a potentially interesting pattern there, the sort of additional use of multiple vehicles would be a strategy that would be sort of possible to see move over, not unique to Iraq and Syria, but we've seen multiple vehicle bombs being used, one to sort of gain entry and furthers following up behind. And I'm fairly certain we can speculate on those scenarios becoming more complex. Manchester, I think, is an important incident in the UK, partly because the number of terrorism experts who, following the attack on Westminster Bridge, said, aha, well, this is proof we've been so good at stopping them producing explosives, that's why we only get this sort of attack happening in the UK. And tragically, I think we probably have to recalibrate how difficult we think it really is for someone to rudimentarily make explosives. We have a tendency to perhaps over-egg how hard it is to make explosives, again, because we tend to use our own metrics of it. Certainly metrics of safety. The impact of kinetic and bladed attacks, I think, goes without saying, but are very difficult for us to try and model. But the one I really want to sort of have you all take away from this, particularly because it's not a new type of attack, and it's something that the UK in particular has suffered with under the provisional IRA attacks, is the use of firebombs or arson. And this is particularly because some people have sort of said, well, you know, the attacks we're seeing at the moment, they're trying to kill people, they're not really trying to destroy property, you know, we can see this trend. And yet in London we saw firebombs in the back of a vehicle, unused, all sorts of speculation to that, work very closely with London Fire Brigade. They actually suspect it's because the airbags in the vehicle went off and partially concussed the people, because they didn't realise they'd hired too good a vehicle. Which I must admit is, you know, possible, and then didn't use them. But you don't use firebombs to kill people, generally speaking. Although then subsequently in the UK, we have the Grenfell Tower fire. And back to this point about where do terrorists get inspiration from? Well, you've got terrorists trying to use firebombs, potentially in a crowded area where, you know, for other countries, but it's, for many countries, the fire service will not go in and try and put out a fire if there is a marauding terrorism firearms attack going on. And then we see a demonstration in the news about how effective a small fire can be in killing people and causing massive impact. In fact, impact so great that arguably it could almost change a government. And that's the point you have to, I think, anchor on. So we have to watch that very carefully. And I have to say, credit to the UK government, they've moved swiftly to try and remove that for normal conventional safety reasons, but I think that's been as important in anything else as well. Okay. Agents that we've seen used, and again, this is back to the point of why doesn't it get used? Well, we've seen nicotine being used as weapons, chlorine, aberrin, thallium, many of these in the experimentations in the University of Mosul where they're trying to see what these poisons would do, VX, sarin, ricin, mustard. Ricin very popular amongst Elvis impersonators in the US, not sure why. Some of the sort of the mad, the bad, and the sad, as we refer to them, seem to quite like it. Fentanyls and carfentanyls actually being used as a drug, but so dangerous we've got officers being hospitalised as they're trying to package evidence from scenes as well. I won't go into epic detail about this, other than to say, back to this point about the internet, we have seen entities around the world faking attacks, particularly on the US, to try and cause economic impact. So one of the examples we have here is a faked attack on a Louisiana chemical plant where they actually sent text messages out to people as well. Unfortunately, they didn't bargain with the fact that particular part of Louisiana doesn't really trust the federal government, so they get text message purporting to be from the federal government. They trust it less than Facebook, although they'd have Facebook covered as well. And similarly, trying to mock up that there was one of my favourite fakes actually, Ebola-ridden zombies roaming the streets of Atlanta, which is quite a good one too. But while we can joke about it, this diverts some real resources. Or real incidents and resources, and that's a worrying potential complexity as well. Particularly in Northern Ireland, we had a number of incidents, funnily enough, particularly to do with arson, where we couldn't respond to an arson incident quickly enough because people were distracted by protests and fake bomb attacks. So never underestimate the impact of a hoax in soaking up resources. C-brain modelling, I mentioned in a talk yesterday, you know, all modeling's wrong, some modeling's useful, and I'd add to that, actually some modelling is hilarious. In some of the scenarios and attacks I've seen, my favourite so far has been a fleet of 747s filled with radioactive material, which is the logistics of that task being, well, challenging to say the least. But if there was one thing I would say about CBRN modelling, and I've got some little examples up there, I won't go through all the slides within the time, but happy to talk about them. I'd say the problem we've got with CBRN modelling is that it's not standardised. People don't talk about the scenarios or why we're doing it or what we're using it. And I have seen some people do some interesting things with CBRN modelling. And there's no reason why it can't be fairly standardised, particularly with close government cooperation as well. The other point about modelling, though, is trying to determine the impact from things like CBRN. What is the level? And Christian and I have spoken about this for years. How clean is clean? But it's not just how clean is clean, how dirty is dirty? When do I have to start the cleanup? That's not standard in European countries. It's not standard around the world. And then once you've decided you have got to clean up, there are very few countries that will commit to a clean-up rate. Well, that's clearly a challenge within insurance. Blast modelling. Blast modelling, actually, we've got fairly well done, but you see an awful lot of people, and I'll start rounding up, you see an awful lot of people casually using blast modelling. You probably want to have a blast engineer talk with you about your blast modelling at some point, no matter how well-resourced you think you are or understanding of blast, because you need a little bit of perspective. And the example we've got up here is modelling that we've been doing with Pori in London. We're over a 10-ton device in a location in London. And you can see on there some highlights where there are very high concentration of blast in areas not in line of sight of the blast by quite a long way. And some very interesting artifacts that have come from that. But interpreting the so what from those requires a blast engineer. I've mentioned about complex attacks, and I think that is a trend, unfortunately, that's going to go forward. And it's something that the modelling of, agent-based modelling, I think both the French and the UK has taken on board as a good way to progress in trying to understand the disruption that those incidents can have. But of course, it's highly based on the availability of counter-terrorism resources and then the response to it. The response in London, 8 minutes, was blistering in speed, I would say, and probably indicative of good intelligence as well. So my final sum-up points there then are, I do think we're probably going to see a rise in disruptive small attacks, but which could get bigger. These dispersed attacks will probably involve a combination of all these attacks, though for countries like the UK, guns are still probably quite unlikely for reasons you can ask me about over coffee. And we must be very cautious about the overmatch of civilian resources, because I think in some cases an attack which we think of as quite light can escalate because we can't respond to it. And that, I think, is probably far enough over. Sorry, Ed.
Great, terrific. Actually, 10 minutes on my nails, so much appreciated that quick canter through. And Deborah, please.